When the car finally stopped at the familiar porch, I felt a tight knot form in my chest. Memories of my childhood and the days spent in this house came flooding back, but along with nostalgia came a subtle sense of unease. Too much time had passed since I last visited. The hustle of the city, work, and family had all swept me into their current, and I had almost lost touch with those who were once so close to me. Mom rushed out to greet me before I even managed to open the door. Her face was glowing with joy, and for a moment I forgot everything and hugged her tightly. It felt comforting to feel that warmth again, so familiar from childhood. But deep inside, despite the joy of the reunion, there was a sense of incompleteness. Ben couldn't make it because of work. He promised to be here tomorrow, but as always, his absence weighed heavily on me. I stepped inside the house, and the warm smell of fresh bread and herbs immediately transported me back to my childhood. Everything in the house had remained almost unchanged, giving me an odd sense of stability. I made my way up to my old room, the one I used to share with Jake, to unpack. Everything was in its place, as if time had stood still here, even though everything inside me had changed. As I was putting my clothes away in the closet, there was a knock on the door. Jake. He stood in the doorway, smiling faintly, as if unsure how to act. We hadn't seen each other in years, and that distance between us felt even more palpable now. When our eyes met, I felt a strange discomfort. His gaze was different, more serious, as if he had become someone I no longer knew. "How are you?" he asked, his voice calm, but it felt like there was an unspoken note beneath his words. "I'm fine, just getting used to everything again," I replied, nodding toward the room. He didn't respond, just looked at me as if he was thinking about something. I didn't know how to feel around him, and that moment was quickly interrupted when Mom called us to the table. The celebration began with the usual greetings from relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone hugged me, asked questions, and discussed the latest news and achievements. There was joy in the air, but in the background I felt a tension. Jake barely spoke to me, but from time to time our eyes met, and it made me uneasy. Something had shifted between us, and I couldn't figure out what. The evening was in full swing. Loud voices, laughter, and the clinking of glasses filled the house, creating an atmosphere of warmth and joy. I sat next to Mom, with Jake on my right. Everyone had gathered around the large table, and memories from the past began to surface. "Do you all remember when Maggie and Jake used to build their fortress out of pillows in the living room?" Uncle Peter chuckled, raising his glass. "They were always inseparable." The table erupted in approving murmurs, and someone picked up the story, recalling how Jake and I would stage battles with imaginary armies. I smiled, but inside something shifted. The memories that once seemed funny and carefree now felt charged with tension. Jake was laughing too, but his gaze... He was looking at me differently. His eyes held something new, something I couldn't quite understand. I felt uneasy. Mom poured me more wine, smiling cheerfully. The reminiscing continued, with everyone sharing moments from our childhood. These conversations brought me back to the days when Jake and I shared a room. Back then, it seemed natural, but now those memories resurfaced with a strange awkwardness. Jake was quietly watching me, his gaze piercing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. "Do you remember how they once locked themselves in a room to hide from everyone?" Mom added with a laugh. "We searched for them for hours." The memory made everyone laugh, but I couldn't relax. My eyes met Jake's, and I felt a spark flicker inside me. There was something too personal in his look, something I had never noticed before. It unsettled me, making me feel not just embarrassed but also strangely anxious. The evening continued, but I couldn't focus on the conversations anymore. The same thought kept spinning in my head. Why did I feel so strange around Jake? What had changed over the years? There was an unspoken tension between us, something that was slowly taking shape but was already palpable, almost physical. After a long evening filled with memories and laughter, the house slowly settled into silence. The guests had gone to their rooms, and Jake and I were left to clear the remaining dishes. Mom, tired from the festivities, had gone to bed first. I knew Jake and I would have to sleep in the old childhood room, and that thought stirred a strange tension inside me. We silently walked upstairs, and I entered the room first. Nothing had changed. The same old wallpaper, the same creaky wooden floor. For a moment, I remembered how Jake and I used to fall asleep here years ago when everything seemed so simple. But now, the room only made me feel uncomfortable. I tried to convince myself that it was just the circumstances, that we both just needed a place to sleep for the night and nothing more. "Just like old times, huh?" Jake said with a smirk as he followed me in. I smiled nervously and started making the bed. His presence felt too close, as if everything had changed. We were both adults now, but the feeling that something was off lingered. I lay down, trying to ignore the tension, but my heart was beating faster than usual. When the lights were turned off, the silence in the room became almost tangible. I hoped that exhaustion would take over and I'd fall asleep quickly, but sleep didn't come. I knew Jake wasn't asleep either. I could sense it. He was close, but this time that closeness felt completely different. "Have you ever thought about how much things have changed?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. His voice was low and gentle, as if waiting to see how I'd respond. "What do you mean?" I whispered back, though I already knew where he was going with this. "Us, Maggie, we've always been close, but for me, it's always been more." My heart tightened at his words. I didn't know what to say. The words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't understand what I felt at that moment. Memories of childhood, of those innocent times when Jake and I were just kids, collided with the sense that something more serious now loomed over us. "I've always wanted to be close to you," he continued, "but now, it's different. It's more than just closeness." I closed my eyes, unsure of what to say. It was too unexpected, too strange. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I couldn't figure out what I truly felt. It was wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't deny that something between us had changed. The silence of the night felt too deep. Darkness enveloped the room, but I couldn't sleep. Jake and I lay on separate beds, and yet there was some invisible thread between us that wouldn't let me rest. We hadn't said a word to each other after his confession, but the tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. Suddenly, I heard Jake's bed creak as he shifted quietly. I didn't move, but internally I tensed, sensing him drawing closer. Barely perceptible movement in the dark. Then I felt his hand gently touch my shoulder. My heart quickened, each beat echoing in my ears. I should stop him. This was wrong. Ben was coming tomorrow. "Jake, don't," I whispered, but my voice trembled treacherously. "I can't stop, Maggie." His whisper was hot and close. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this." His hand slid over my shoulder and I closed my eyes, trying to gather the strength to resist. I had to stop this. But with every touch, something inside me weakened. Years of hidden emotions, of feelings I couldn't name or understand, suddenly surged to the surface. I had felt this since childhood, but had never admitted it to myself. "We can't," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. "Ben is coming tomorrow." "I know." His voice was quiet but firm. "But right now, in this moment, it's just you and me." I felt his touches grow bolder, his hands slowly moving over my body, stirring a confusing mix of fear and desire. I knew it was wrong, that I should stop, but everything happening felt so real, so natural. My thoughts were jumbled and my body no longer seemed to listen to me. Before I knew it, I was in his arms, whispering to myself that this was wrong, that I had to stop. But his warmth, his closeness, it was all stronger than my will. Seconds turned into minutes, and the passion overwhelmed us both. "Ben," I murmured quietly, as if reminding myself, but my words were lost in the dark. A forbidden passion ignited between us, the kind I had long refused to acknowledge. We both knew it was wrong, that tomorrow would bring consequences, but right now none of that seemed to matter. When I opened my eyes, the sunlight was already streaming through the curtains, filling the room with a soft glow. My head felt heavy, as if I hadn't slept at all, and my heart was pounding in my chest, almost ready to leap out. The first thing I felt was the warmth of another body next to me. Jake was lying on the same bed, his arm wrapped around my waist. Everything from last night came rushing back to me in an overwhelming wave. I closed my eyes, hoping it was a dream, but the feel of his skin against mine was too real. Guilt washed over me like a tidal wave. I carefully untangled myself from his embrace and slowly sat up, trying not to wake him. My head was spinning, and the overwhelming sense of despair grew inside me. How could I let this happen? I looked down at his sleeping face, peaceful, and I couldn't believe how natural this seemed for him. He looked as if everything was fine, as if what happened last night was completely normal. But for me, it was far from normal. My thoughts were a mess. I tried to convince myself it was an accident, that we just got caught up in the moment, overwhelmed by emotions. But that didn't bring me any comfort. This wasn't an accident. I knew it deep down. These feelings had been living inside us for years, buried, suppressed. But last night they had broken free. I quietly got out of bed, panic slowly rising inside me. My hands were shaking, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at Jake as he slept. He looked so calm, so serene, as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was falling apart. Desperate to escape my thoughts, I headed to the bathroom. The mirror reflected a face I barely recognized, tired with red eyes and pale skin. I ran my hand through my hair and sighed. I tried to figure out what to do next. Ben was arriving today. How could I face him with this weight of betrayal hanging over me? When I returned to the room, Jake was already awake. He was lying on his side, propped up on one elbow, watching me with that same calm smile I had seen last night. "Good morning," he said, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice from trembling. He just lay there looking at me, and I couldn't meet his gaze. His confidence and calm were driving me mad. How could he be like this? Memories of last night came flooding back. The touches, the words, the passion I had refused to acknowledge for so long. It all came crashing down on me. I wanted to convince myself it was a mistake, that it was an accident. But every time I remembered what had happened, the desire I had hidden for years reignited inside me. And now I was terrified to admit that something between us had changed, and it was much stronger than I was ready to accept. When the car pulled up to the house, my heart clenched. It was Ben. I stood by the window watching him approach, trying to keep a calm expression on my face. Inside, though, everything was different. Waves of guilt and confusion crashed over me, but I couldn't allow myself to show even the slightest hint of distress. I stepped out onto the porch, forcing a smile. Ben looked tired, but his face lit up with joy when he saw me. I tried to remind myself that everything would be fine. We had always dealt with challenges, and this time would be no different. But inside, something was off. The memories of last night wouldn't leave me alone. "Hey, sweetheart," Ben said, pulling me into a hug. His embrace was warm and reassuring as it always had been. I froze in his arms for a moment, trying to find the sense of peace that his touch usually brought. But it wasn't the same. Everything had changed. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound as natural as possible. He kissed my cheek and walked toward the house with a smile. I grabbed his hand, feeling my fingers tremble slightly. It felt like every glance of his could see right through me, could read the guilt I was trying so hard to hide. Inside, the atmosphere felt tense. Mom greeted Ben with a joyful hug, offering him a seat at the table. Jake was there too, sitting across from me, and our eyes met again. My heart skipped a beat. He was too calm, too composed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed between us, and it was no accident. "How was the drive?" Mom asked, drawing Ben's attention away. "All good," he replied, sitting down next to me. "A bit tired, but I'm glad to finally be here." I sat next to him, but I felt entirely different. Ben was talking about work, about plans for the next few days, but I barely heard him. Inside, a battle was raging. I was terrified that he would notice my tension, the unnatural way I was acting. But how could I hide what had happened? Every little thing, my glance, the tremor in my voice, felt too obvious to me. Jake was acting like nothing had changed. He didn't look at me often, but when he did, it was enough to ignite that tension between us again. I tried not to look his way, but every time our eyes met, I felt that strange, inexplicable pull toward him flare up inside me once more. My smile felt fake. I didn't know how much longer I could pretend that everything was fine, that I was still the same person. Ben trusted me. He looked at me with such love, and it only made my guilt worse. I knew something had to change, but I didn't know how to handle it. The evening was approaching dinner, and as usual, Mom was busy cooking. She asked me to help in the kitchen, and Jake, as if choosing the moment deliberately, offered his assistance. I knew this was inevitable. Ever since Ben arrived, the tension between Jake and me had been palpable. Now, left alone together, it became almost unbearable. "Maggie, could you chop the vegetables?" Mom pointed to the table. "And Jake, you can help me with the meat." When Mom left the kitchen, the air became thicker, as if something invisible had settled between us. My hands trembled as I picked up the knife and started cutting the vegetables. I tried to focus on the task, but every time I glanced at Jake, guilt and a strange desire stirred inside me. "We need to talk," he said softly, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but I knew this conversation wasn't casual. I couldn't look him in the eye, but his presence was almost overwhelming. "Jake, not now." My voice was weak, but I tried to convince both him and myself. "You know you can't ignore this." He stepped closer, and I felt his hand on mine. "What happened?" It wasn't a mistake. I looked away, but I knew he was right. The events of the past few days, especially last night, had left me drowning in conflicting emotions. I tried to convince myself it was just a fleeting attraction, but deep down I knew it was more than that. "Jake, it was a mistake. We can't—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in my throat and my voice trailed off. "You don't believe that?" he whispered, his voice insistent. "You want this as much as I do." I turned away, trying to hide the emotions swirling inside me, but every word he spoke pierced through me, forcing me to confront what I feared. No matter how hard I tried to deny it, the pull was too strong. "What if someone finds out?" I tried to steer the conversation toward the fear of being caught. "No one will find out," he said confidently. "Not unless you want them to." His words threw me off balance. How could I hide this any longer? How could I live with this feeling, knowing it was pulling me back to him? I felt this secret connection growing stronger, and every glance, every encounter only deepened it. At that moment, Mom returned to the kitchen, and I finally exhaled. Jake and I quickly moved apart, trying to act as naturally as possible, but inside, emotions still boiled. I was terrified of what would happen next, knowing that sooner or later, this moment would come to light. Mom asked me to go to the pantry to grab some supplies for dinner. I nodded silently, hoping that this short walk would help me gather my thoughts and distance myself from the tension. But Jake immediately volunteered to come along, and I knew I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. Once we were alone in the cramped pantry, I nervously began searching for the items. The room felt stifling, and the tension between us grew with every passing second. Jake stepped closer and I could feel his presence. My heart raced. "Maggie, we can't keep ignoring this," he said, his voice low and insistent. I froze, unable to turn away or walk out. We had been avoiding the reality of what was happening between us for too long. Jake moved closer, and I felt his breath on my neck. Inside, everything was churning with conflicting emotions. But with every step he took, I felt myself inch closer to the point of no return. "Jake, please," I whispered, unable to finish my sentence. But he didn't reply. Instead, he gently cupped my face in his hands and brought his lips to mine. I couldn't resist. His kiss was passionate yet tender, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. My body responded and all my doubts seemed to vanish. We were lost in the moment, forgetting everything else. Time no longer mattered, and nothing existed except for us. But the sudden creak of the door yanked me back to reality. "What are you doing?" Mom's voice cut through the air like a bolt of lightning. I jerked away from Jake, my heart pounding wildly. Mom stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and fury. Her eyes darted between me and Jake as if she couldn't believe what she had just seen. "How could you?" she began shouting at us, her voice trembling with anger. "In my house! I thought you were family!" I didn't know what to say. I felt like the entire world was collapsing around me. Everything that had happened over the past few days had come crashing down in the most brutal way possible. I couldn't find the words to explain or defend myself. Jake stood beside me in silence, his expression dark, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. Mom continued yelling, her voice breaking from the weight of her disappointment and rage. I stood there, barely holding back tears. It was all too real now, and I realized there was no turning back. Mom's scream tore through the silence like a bolt of lightning. I jerked away from Jake, my heart stopping in my chest. She stood in the pantry doorway, her face a mix of shock, fury, and disbelief. In that moment, I felt everything collapse. Everything I had tried to hide, everything I had denied to myself. It was now laid bare for everyone to see. "How could you?" Her voice shook with anger as she looked between the two of us. "In my house! What kind of people are you?" I felt something inside me shatter. I stood there, unable to move or speak. My throat was dry and the words were stuck deep within me. Jake was silent too, but his face remained serious, as if he had already accepted the inevitability of this moment. Mom kept screaming, her voice growing louder and louder until the sound of hurried footsteps filled the room. "Ben!" My husband burst into the pantry, suspicion already etched on his face. But the moment he saw our faces, everything became clear. He didn't ask any questions. His eyes, filled with rage and pain, locked onto mine. "What does this mean?" His voice was low but threatening. He looked between Jake and me, trying to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't breathe. This was the end. I saw the fury flare in his eyes, the silence only intensifying his suspicions. I knew there was no turning back, and I knew I had to explain everything. But how? How could I explain something that had no justification? "Ben!" I started, but my voice cracked. "What happened?" He was yelling now, his rage no longer hidden. "This can't be what it looks like. Tell me it's not." I couldn't lie. I stood before him feeling everything we had built together fall apart. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear his words. Jake remained silent, his face unreadable. Mom stood nearby, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with contempt. I could see the judgment in her gaze, but there was nothing I could say that would change what had happened. I tried again, but my words were empty. I didn't know what to say. "You cheated on me? With Jake?" His voice was full of pain, and I realized there was no point in denying it. "Yes," I forced out, feeling everything inside me break. In that moment, everything became final. Ben took a step back as if he had been physically struck. He looked at me with an expression of betrayal, as if I had hurt him in the worst possible way. Ben stood in front of me, his face twisted with anger and pain. All the love and trust I had seen in his eyes over the years were gone. I couldn't look him in the face, but I knew he was waiting for an answer. "I want to know what's going on." His voice was low, but there was a clear threat behind it. "Is there something between you and Jake? I want the truth." I felt that I couldn't hide anymore. Everything I'd been trying to deny was now laid bare for everyone to see. "Yes," I finally forced out, my voice trembling as much as my heart. "There's something between us, but I can't even explain what it is. I don't understand it myself." Ben took a step back as if my words had physically struck him. His face contorted further, fury blazing in his eyes. "You don't know? Are you serious? You've destroyed everything." His voice rose, growing louder with every word. "I trusted you. I thought you'd never do this. I thought we were a family." I couldn't look him in the eye. My own tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't find a single word to justify what had happened. This was the moment I realized there was no turning back. "You've destroyed everything, Maggie," he whispered. But there was more than just rage in his voice. There was deep, unbearable pain. "How could you?" Mom, shocked and overwhelmed, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with determination. She turned to Jake, who stood silently, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. "You need to leave, Jake," she said firmly but quietly. "I can't let you stay here after this." Jake didn't move. His gaze fell on me, and at that moment I felt the full weight of what had happened. My husband, my mother, everyone had turned away from me. But the worst part was that Ben was right. I had destroyed everything. "How could you destroy our family?" he repeated, his voice breaking with pain. "I'll never be able to forget this." His words hit me like a heavy blow. I hadn't just ruined our marriage. I had shattered everything that had ever connected us. In that moment, I knew I had lost him forever. Ben silently stood by his suitcase, packing the things he had brought to my mother's house. His movements were slow but deliberate. He wasn't in a rush, and every action felt like the final blow to the remnants of our life together that I so desperately tried to hold on to. "Ben, please." My voice was weak, almost hopeless. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I still hoped for a miracle. "Let me explain." He lifted his gaze, cold indifference filling his eyes, as if what we once had no longer mattered. "No, Maggie," he said with icy calmness. "This is the end. I'll gather all my things, go back home, and leave on a business trip. It's the last thing I can do for you, to give you time to pack and leave my house." Those words hit me like a thunderbolt. He wasn't just leaving for a few days. He had made it clear this was his final act of kindness. Time for me to gather my belongings and leave the home we once shared as a family. His face remained resolute, with no trace of doubt or regret. "Ben, please." I struggled to find the words, but they were caught in my throat. I knew I had lost him forever. He looked at me as if I were a stranger. "I can't stay. I don't want to see you." His voice was low but filled with determination. "This is the end." He zipped up his suitcase, picked it up, and walked toward the door. I wanted to move closer, to stop him, but I couldn't move. His back was straight, and every step he took was one step further away from any chance of reconciliation. "You've destroyed everything." His words pierced the silence as he opened the door without looking back. "And I can't live with that anymore." With that, he left. I heard the door close behind him, and that sound felt like the final blow to my shattered heart. I stood there alone, in the same room where everything had changed forever. A few minutes later, Jake entered the room. His face was grim, and I could see that he, like me, understood that things had gone too far. A few days had passed since Ben left, leaving me alone with the shattered remnants of our life. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt empty and cold. Waves of regret washed over me, and every minute spent in solitude was unbearable. I couldn't forgive myself for what had happened. I betrayed Ben, destroyed everything we had built. My attempts to justify myself made no sense because I knew there was no justification. It was all my choices, my actions, and now the consequences would stay with me forever. My mother could no longer look at me the way she once did. She didn't hide her disappointment. Every glance, full of judgment, felt like a knife in my back. She didn't say much, but her silence was more powerful than any words. "How could you?" she asked one day, her voice quiet but full of pain. I had no answer. I knew I hadn't only hurt Ben, but her as well. She couldn't reconcile with the fact that her daughter had betrayed the family they once thought was unbreakable. Jake, on the other hand, tried to support me, but his attempts only served as a constant reminder of what we had done. Every time he came to see me, I felt even more despair. I saw his regret, his desire to help, but it only deepened my guilt. "We need to talk," I said one day when he visited again. His eyes were tired, but he nodded. "You understand this can't go on," I continued, struggling to find the right words. "What happened between us? It was a mistake." Jake lowered his head, as if he knew I was right but couldn't accept it. "I know," he finally said, his voice quiet. "But I still want to be there, to help you through this." "That's impossible," I whispered. "Our relationship has destroyed too much. I can't continue this, Jake. All I feel now is pain." He didn't argue. We both knew our relationship couldn't continue. Everything between us had been a mistake, and now the only thing left was to face the consequences. I was alone. Loneliness filled every corner of my life, leaving me with nothing but memories, regrets, and the silence that seemed to weigh heavier on me with each passing day. The inner turmoil that had been building inside me finally reached its breaking point. I couldn't hide behind guilt anymore or remain lost in emotions that no longer made sense. My heart was heavy, but I knew the only way forward was to end what had begun as a mistake. Jake walked into the room, his face just as tired and lost as mine. We both knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. I looked at him, remembering how it all started. Innocent childhood memories, warm moments that had once felt so right. But now, they didn't matter. "We need to talk," I began, lowering my gaze. All of this was a mistake. He didn't respond, but I saw his jaw clench. He already knew what I was going to say. We got caught up in memories, in the past. This wasn't real love, I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to let it go. I can't carry this weight anymore, and neither can you. Jake took a step closer but stopped, as if realizing that nothing could change the outcome. You're right, he finally said, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. I nodded, knowing he felt the same as I did. Our connection had been a mistake, built on desire and on memories that had long lost their meaning. We both knew it, but accepting it was harder than I could have imagined. We both need to start over, I whispered. It's the only way to move forward. Jake was silent for a long time before quietly asking, Is this the end? I nodded, feeling my heart tighten with pain. Yes, this was the end for both of us, the end for a relationship that never should have begun. He accepted it with sadness, but without resistance. A deep wound remained between us, one that might never fully heal. But we both knew this was the only way. I watched him leave the room, and with each step, I felt the last thread that connected us slowly disappear. Now I was alone. But with that loneliness came the realization that I had finally made the right choice. As I stood in front of the door to my new home, suitcase in hand, I was overwhelmed by a strange sense of emptiness. There was nothing familiar here, no old belongings, no memories, no people who once filled my life. Everything was new, and the feeling of change was both terrifying and liberating. The house was small, modest, but there was something peaceful about it. I stepped inside, looking around at the bare walls and empty rooms. This place felt like the beginning of something new, but at the same time, it was a reminder of how much I had lost. I walked slowly through the rooms, realizing that now, everything depended solely on me. The recovery from what I had destroyed would be long and difficult. Ben was gone. Jake was no longer a part of my life, and my relationship with my mother remained broken. I was left alone, with myself and with my mistakes. Mistakes that had changed me forever. I couldn't go back and undo them no matter how much I wished I could. But with every step forward, I began to understand that accepting those mistakes was the only path to healing. The past couldn't be reclaimed, and I had to learn to live with what I had done. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the living room, closing my eyes and feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over me. The memories of the last few months were vivid and painful, but I knew they were now part of my story. A story that had changed me, broken me, and pieced me back together. I didn't know what my future would hold. It was filled with uncertainty, and I still had a long way to go to find peace with myself. But now that I was alone, I began to realize that this solitude didn't have to be destructive. Perhaps in it, I would find something I had long lost: inner peace. I hoped that in time I could learn to forgive myself and move forward without constantly looking back. Life was now my own personal journey, and I was ready to start it with a clean slate.